Hello, this is Dr. E, and we're going to be doing Unit 8, 2 units here, 8.7 and 8.9. 8.7 is about persistent organic pollutants, and 8.8 is about biomagnification. They go hand in hand. 8.7, persistent organic pollutants. We're basically going to be wanting to be able to describe the effect of persistent organic pollutants on ecosystems. There's 3 essential knowledges that you will need to know, and the suggested concept is being able to explain the concept. Persistent organic pollutants are long-lasting. That's what persistence. Organic means they're carbon-based. They're synthetic, meaning they're human-made, that do not easily break down in the environment. They can accumulate and build up in water, soil, or fats. They're fat-soluble. They may also accumulate persistent animal fat tissue instead of passing through the body. They typically don't dissolve into the blood or urine. These things can slowly be released from fatty tissue into bloodstream and impact brain and other organs over time. So if, for example, they get into the fat and you lose weight, or the animal is basically not getting enough food, instead of being stored in the fatty tissue, it's going to be released fairly rapidly. And so a lot's going to be released fairly rapidly and go to these tissues, possibly causing great damage to the organism. Examples would be DDT, which is no longer used, PCBs, which are plastic paint additive, PBDEs, which are fireproofing, BPA, which is a plastic additive, dioxins, phthalates, and perchlorates, which are in rocket fuel. Pesticides, one of the examples used to be DDT. It was widely used because it was so effective until it was found by Rachel and reported by Rachel Carson in the book Silent Spring back in the 1960s and 70s, how damaging it was to organisms, especially birds. It's still persistent in soils and sediments, an aqueous ecosystem, and builds up in the food webs. In fact, we in LA, because we are close to one of the sources of production of DDT, we have it a little bit higher. In fact, Catalina still has it fairly high. It has been reported that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of 50-gallon drums of DDT in the bottom of the ocean between here and Catalina Island. Medications, pharmaceutical compounds, such as steroids, reproductive hormones, antibiotics, they pass through the body. Once they pass through the body, generally they are no longer effective. However, when they go into the sewage and into the sewage treatment plant, there they can become effective again and damage organisms downstream of the treatment plant. They persist in streams, rivers, and disrupt aqueous organisms' endocrine function. Dioxins. It's a byproduct of fertilizer production and burning of medical waste, fossil fuels, and biomass. 90% of human dioxin exposure comes from animal fats, such as meat, dairy, fish, once dioxin build up in the animal fat tissue. Some other examples. For example, PCBs. PCBs are additives in paint and plastics. They're released into the aquatic ecosystem by industrial wastewater. They are very toxic to fish, causing spawning failure and endocrine disruption. What's interesting about them is that they are heavier than water, and therefore they sink to the bottom. And there was a case about 10 years ago where in the Hudson River upstream from New York City, that there was PCBs up to a foot thick on the bottom of the Hudson River. They cause reproductive failure and cancer in humans, and we get it from animal products. Perchlorates are given off by rockets, missiles, and fireworks. They're especially common near military testing sites or rocket launch pads, sort of like, what JPL was initially back in the 50s and 60s. They remain in the soil, can leach into groundwater, or run off into surface waters. Persistent organic can travel long distance through wind and water, impacting ecosystems far, far away. And so they come here, they can go here, and they can come down, they go into organisms, and long, long way. Wastewater released from industrial processes, leached from landfills, or improperly buried industrial waste, fertilizer, pesticide production, emission from burning waste, and biomass. They can enter the water, eaten by animals, stored in their fat, and eaten by humans, or taken in via drinking water. So, the FRQ for this unit is going to be explaining environmental concepts and processes. Can you explain why the release of PCBs into an aquatic ecosystem may have longer-lasting negative impacts on organisms than the release of synthetic nitrates? Section 8.8 on biomagnification. Here we're going to be looking at two learning objectives: being able to describe bioaccumulation and biomagnification, and being able to describe the effect of bioaccumulation and biomagnification. There's 5 essential knowledges that you should be able to do by the end. Suggested activity would be able to identify a testable hypothesis or scientific question for an investigation. So bioaccumulation is absorption and concentration of compounds, especially fat-soluble ones like POPs, in the cells and fat tissues of organisms. Because fat-soluble compounds like POPs and methylmercury don't dissolve easily in water, they don't enter the blood, and therefore they don't leave the body via urination. Instead, they build up in fat tissue over time. They accumulate in the living organism. That's why it's bioaccumulation. And what happens is they get more and more and more because we eat more and more lower down. And they just stay in our bodies. Biomagnification, on the other hand, is increasing concentration of fat-soluble compounds like methylmercury and POPs in every level of the trophic pyramid. Biomagnification begins with POPs or methylmercury in the sediments or plants in the ecosystem, such as phytoplankton or grass. Then primary consumers like zooplankton, bottom-feeding fish, insects take in the POPs. Then they're eaten by producers, causing bioaccumulation of POPs in their tissue. The secondary consumers eat primary consumers and take in all the POPs in their tissue. And they don't just eat one, they eat many, many per day. And all that is stored in their tissues. Because of the 10% rule, organisms at each level need to eat more and more biomass to receive enough energy. That means more and more and higher levels of POPs go into their systems and accumulate over their lifetimes. Large predators like salmon, dolphins, and whales have the highest POP methylmercury levels around. DDT was banned in many developed countries, but still persists in sediments of many bodies of water. Taken in by bottom feeders or zooplankton, it's biomagnified up to higher and higher levels. One of the signs you can see down by Cabrillo Aquarium is a sign out by the ocean that indicates that effect. So it says, please don't eat these types of fish because they will have higher levels of toxins because of biomagnification. When they reach the highest level of the top predators, especially predatory birds like eagles and osprey. Problem is, it causes a thinning of eggshell in these birds. Therefore, when they sit on the eggs to help them hatch, they break. And you can see here it's how it has caused problems with the peregrine falcon eggs. This causes thinning of eggshells in these birds. It's linked to massive population decline of a bald eagle in the United States, which prompted the passage of the Endangered Species Act. So down at the bottom is very, very low parts per million. But by the time it gets up to the osprey, it's up to 25 parts per million in their cells. Biomagnification of methylmercury is emitted from burning fossil fuels and by volcanoes. It's carried by winds and deposited in water where bacteria convert it into toxic methylmercury. It's taken in by phytoplankton and biomagnified up higher and higher and higher, as you can see here, up when it goes up the food web, when it reaches the highest levels in top predators in tuna, sharks, and whales. This is a neurotoxin. It damages the central nervous system of these animals. Human exposure to methylmercury and POPS comes from eating large predatory fish like tuna and salmon and other seafood. Biomagnification of methylmercury, it can damage and cause problems in humans. So again, it gets some level in mayflies. The bluegill eats it, gets higher levels because they don't just eat one. Bass eat many bluegill, and then we eat many of that because we can take it in all at once. Well, we can see here how pollutants have long-term effects on organisms. Even when they are not dangerous initially to kill them outright, through bioaccumulation, biomagnification, they get higher and higher levels. So things like PCBs go into the phytoplankton. Phytoplankton is eaten by zooplankton in tons and tons of them. That goes into small fish, which is amplified, goes into the salmon, and eventually it gets up to the apex like the orcas, where there's high accumulation. Then, if we have something like an El Nino where there's not enough food, we can have the death of the orca. That's happened in Seattle back in our last El Nino. Why? Because they had accumulated so much of this into their fatty tissue that when they were starving, not getting enough food, all of it was released very, very rapidly and caused great damage to them. So practice FRQ for 8.8. Scientists suspect that the compound ewolsinium released from worn down bike tires biomagnifies in the tissues of aquatic organisms in a nearby lake. Can you identify a testable hypothesis that the scientists may use for their study? I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much.